Hello, my name is Scott Graves, and today I'm going to be telling you about the history and evolution of rock and roll. Now, to understand the history of rock and roll, you have to understand first what rock and roll is. Rock and roll is generally classified as the sound of a guitar boosted by an electric amp and supported by one, if not multiple basses, and backed by a full set of drums. Now, this is not an absolute hard definition. However, it is considered the best general definition for rock and roll. Now, to understand the origins of rock and roll, you have to understand that the end of the Second World War hit the entire world very hard. One of the only good things to come out of the end of the Second World War is the radio, which had previously only been used in military endeavors, began use for civilians. This caused the radio to quickly become the center of the home, and it was not unusual in the late 40s and throughout the 50s to see the entire family gathered up at night around the radio. The central family radio allowed for new forms of entertainment, such as talk shows and early forms of podcast, and most importantly to this discussion, rock and roll. Now, rock and roll started out as rhythm and blues. At the time, it was called race music. Now, rhythm and blues was mixed with country music, and you get the earliest forms of rock and roll we have. Now, generally, it's considered that the first time rhythm and blues was played for a live audience over air was in Cleveland, Ohio, by a man named Alan Freed, who was a disc jockey at the local radio station, who first coined the term rock and roll and played it on air. Now, as rock and roll gained its popularity throughout the 50s, legends started to arrive on the scene, two of which most popular are Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley. They were known as the father of rock and roll and the king of rock and roll, and it was quoted as saying they were not the men who created it, but they redefined it and adjusted the attitude of the entire profession. Now, after the 50s took place and all these legends arrived, the UK was also getting its new introduction to rock and roll. This caused the rise of several bands such as the Beatles, most popular, and the Rolling Stones, a very close second. These bands in the UK gained so much popularity that it's caused what's known as the British invasion. Now, this is when all of these British bands came over with their version of rock music into America and throughout the world, causing an increase of international popularity that the genre had not had before, just being isolated to an American audience. Meanwhile, in America, there were several new forms of rock and roll being used while the British were invading. This is generally the rise of garage rock, which was a raw, aggressive form of rock that the world was not quite accustomed to, that, as the name implies, sounds like it was practiced in a garage. Now, the new blues rock was almost the exact opposite of the British rock that was being brought over. British rock was generally used higher tempo and more upbeat paces, while blues rock was almost the exact opposite. And lastly, in the Southeast and the South in general, there was what's known as Southern rock, with such noticeable bands as Lynyrd Skynyrd and ZZ Top performing all throughout the 60s. There were several other new styles that took root in the 60s that were not quite as up there as the previous ones. However, there was a new classification for rock music that came through at the time. Soft rock, which was their general softer played rocks like psychedelic and folk rock. Hard rock, which is self-explanatory, it was harder than other ones, and the early versions of heavy metal, which was hard rock but played with more intensity and volume. Now, as the 60s wound to a halt, the 70s and 80s came in, which is known for many as the golden age of rock and roll. The 70s and 80s gave rise to popular bands like Queen, Kansas, Aerosmith, AC/DC, Black Sabbath, one of the most popular rock bands of all time, Kiss. Now, during this time, there were also new types of rock being brought out onto the scene, such as punk rock and heavy metal. These new types of rock would later pave the way for the rest of the 80s, the late 80s and the 90s. Now, in the 90s, rock saw a slight decline in its popularity because of the new kid on the block, rap, which quickly took the scene and started topping the charts. Now, despite the fact that rap came onto the scene and was stealing the spotlight, there existed a new form of rock in the 90s that got people interested in it again, grunge rock. Noticeable for this is Nickelback and a few others that don't come to mind at the moment. But you had some that if you couldn't beat them, join them. The pop epidemic that came in the late 80s and the 90s was crazy. So people decided mix pop and rock. This new pop rock was generally more widely accepted in the 90s than other forms of rock that were heavier or more metal. The new alternative, indie rock, in the 70s and 80s, indie rock and alternative rock were generally classified as the same thing. Now, the new kid on the scene, rap, decided to mix with rock to make alternative metal or rap rock. And the 90s and the 2000s especially came with the garage rock revival, where more bands in the 2000s especially came through with the rocking in the garage style. Unfortunately, nothing is built to last. In the end of the 2000s, especially in the 2010s, rock music saw a steady decline in its popularity, and the overall downfall of rock music was the absence of money. They hadn't made any new chart toppers in years, and it didn't look like any was going to come through. And throughout the 2010s, all the way up to 2020, rock took a back seat to other things like rap, hip-hop, and pop. That concludes my speech over the history and evolution of rock and roll, and I would like to thank you for listening.